In the year 1519, a Spanish soldier named Bernal Diaz stood at the edge of a mountain pass and looked down upon something he could not explain. Below him, rising from the center of a vast shimmering lake, was a city unlike anything he or any European had ever seen. Towers of white stone caught the morning sun. Causeways stretched across the water like the arms of a giant. Thousands of canoes moved silently through glittering canals. He later wrote that some of his companions asked whether it was all a dream. It was not a dream. It was Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, and one of the greatest cities ever built by human hands. To understand what made Tenochtitlan so extraordinary, we must go back nearly 2 centuries before that Spanish soldier stood speechless on his mountain. We must return to the year 1325, to a wandering people with nothing but a prophecy and a desperate hunger for a home. The Mexica, as they called themselves, had been wandering the harsh landscapes of central Mexico for generations. They were not powerful, they were not wealthy. They were a semi-nomadic people, often enslaved or expelled by stronger neighbors, carrying with them the memory of a god's promise. Their patron deity Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, god of war and sun, had told them through his priests to search for a sign. They would know their destined homeland when they found an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. For decades, the Mexica wandered and suffered. They served as mercenaries for more powerful city-states. They were driven from fertile lands. They watched their children grow up without a homeland. And then somewhere around 1325, on a small, swampy, largely unwanted island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, they saw it. An eagle. A cactus. A serpent. The sign of their god. The sign of their future. What they chose to build on that island would take the breath away from the entire world. The island itself was a challenge. It was marshy and unstable, surrounded by the brackish waters of a high-altitude lake. Most civilizations would have looked at this location and moved on. The Mexica looked at it and saw opportunity. They began to transform their environment with a genius that still astonishes engineers today. Their primary tool was the chinampa, what later observers would call the floating garden. By weaving together reeds and roots, piling lake sediment and organic matter on top, and anchoring these platforms with willow trees, the Aztecs created artificial islands of extraordinary fertility. The chinampas did not merely float, they were rooted into the lake bed, stable enough to walk on, rich enough to produce multiple harvests every single year. With these engineered fields, the Mexica could feed a growing population, and the population grew fast. Within a generation, the small island settlement had become a real city. Within 2 generations, it had become a power. Within a century, it had become the heart of an empire. By the late 1400s, Tenochtitlan was home to somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people. To put that in perspective, London at the same time had fewer than 50,000 inhabitants. Paris was smaller, Rome was smaller. Only a handful of cities in the entire world, Constantinople, perhaps Beijing, could rival the scale of this Aztec metropolis rising from its mountain lake. The city was built on a strict and deliberate plan. At its very center stood the sacred precinct, a walled ceremonial complex containing more than 70 structures, dominated by the towering double pyramid of the Templo Mayor. This was not merely a temple. It was the axis of the Aztec universe, the point where heaven, earth, and the underworld converged. Its twin staircases rose to 2 shrines at the summit, one dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of war, and one to Tlatelolco, god of rain and agriculture. The duality was intentional. War and sustenance, conquest and harvest, the 2 engines of Aztec civilization, side by side, reaching toward the sky. The pyramid was not built once, it was built 7 times, each new emperor encasing the previous structure in a larger shell, like a Russian doll of sacred stone. By the time the Spanish arrived, the Templo Mayor rose approximately 30 meters above the plaza, a white and red painted colossus visible from every corner of the city and from miles across the lake. Around the sacred precinct, the city radiated outward in 4 great quarters, divided by the cardinal directions. Each quarter had its own neighborhoods, its own local temples, its own markets. The streets were a combination of solid causeways and canals, and movement through the city could be made either on foot or by canoe. There were no wheeled vehicles in Mesoamerica, but the Aztecs had no need for them. The water was their highway. 3 great causeways connected the island city to the mainland. The largest, running south to the town of Iztapalapa, was wide enough for 10 horsemen to ride side by side, a fact that would later prove strategically critical during the Spanish siege. Each causeway was interrupted at intervals by wooden drawbridges that could be raised to defend the city. Tenochtitlan was not just beautiful, it was a fortress. Water management was one of the greatest engineering achievements of the Aztec world. The lake surrounding the city was actually a complex system of interconnected basins, some saltwater and some fresh. The Aztecs built a massive dike, the Albarradón de Nezahualcóyotl, stretching nearly 16 kilometers across the lake, separating the fresh water near the city from the saltwater beyond. This allowed them to control flooding, maintain irrigation, and keep the canals of the city clean and navigable. Fresh drinking water was brought to the island through two great aqueducts, running along the causeways from springs on the mainland. One came from Chapultepec in the west, the other from Coyoacán in the south. These were not simple pipes, they were double-channeled stone conduits so that one channel could be cleaned and repaired while the other continued to flow. The Aztecs understood redundancy in infrastructure 2,000 years before modern urban planners made it a standard practice. The market of Tlatelolco, located in the northern part of the island on what had once been a sister city, was the commercial heart of the empire. When the Spanish soldier Bernal Diaz visited it, he wrote that he had been to great markets in Spain and Italy, but never had he seen anything so large, so orderly, or so full of goods. The market operated every day, with a great market day every 5 days that drew tens of thousands of buyers and sellers from across the empire. Everything imaginable was for sale. Cacao beans, used as currency, changed hands in vast quantities. Merchants sold jade and obsidian, feathers of the quetzal bird, jaguar skins, rubber balls, gold dust and quills, cotton cloth in hundreds of colors, medicinal herbs, live animals, prepared food, pottery, tools, and slaves. Each type of good had its own designated section of the market. Inspectors walked the aisles ensuring fair weights and honest dealing. There was even a court at the market where disputes between buyers and sellers were resolved on the spot. The people who moved through this market were as diverse as the empire itself. Aztec nobles in elaborate cotton mantles and jade jewelry. Merchants from distant provinces carrying goods on their backs with tumplines. Priests in black robes with long unkempt hair. Warriors in quilted cotton armor. Women in embroidered huipiles grinding corn and selling tortillas. Children running errands. Porters bent under enormous loads, the entire social spectrum of a civilization visible in one place, on one morning in one market by a lake in the mountains of Mexico. The nobility of Tenochtitlan lived in palaces that would have been recognizable to any Mediterranean aristocrat, though built in a style entirely their own. Single-story structures of stone and plaster surrounded open courtyards filled with gardens, fountains, and aviaries. The palace of the Emperor Moctezuma II, which Cortés would later appropriate as his headquarters, was said to contain hundreds of rooms, a zoo with every animal in the empire, an aviary with every bird, pools of fresh and saltwater fish, an armory, a treasury, and quarters for thousands of servants and officials. The Aztec concept of beauty was inseparable from order and abundance. A beautiful palace was one where everything was provided for, where the gardens were perfectly maintained, where the animals were healthy and numerous, where the storerooms were full. Beauty was a form of power made visible. Aztec society was rigidly hierarchical, but it was not a simple caste system. Talent and military achievement could elevate a man from a humble background. The highest military orders, the Eagle Warriors and the Jaguar Warriors, were open to commoners who demonstrated exceptional valor in battle. Education was mandatory for all children, male and female, at a level that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. Boys attended either the Telpotcali, a neighborhood school focused on practical skills and military training, or the Calmecac, a more elite institution attached to the temples where they learned history, astronomy, law, and ritual. The Aztec calendar was a masterpiece of astronomical observation. They maintained two interlocking cycles, a 365-day solar calendar and a 260-day ritual calendar, which combined to create a 52-year cycle, at the end of which the Aztecs feared the sun might not rise again. The new fire ceremony, held at the end of each cycle, was one of the most dramatic rituals in the ancient world. All fires in the empire were extinguished. People waited in darkness on the hilltops. Priests climbed to the hill of the star and watched the Pleiades. If the stars continued to move across the sky, the world would continue. A new fire was drilled on the chest of a sacrificial victim, and runners carried the flame across the empire, relighting every hearth from the sacred source. Religion permeated every aspect of life in Tenochtitlan. The city itself was understood as a sacred landscape, a replica of the mythological geography of the cosmos. The Templo Mayor represented the mountain at the center of the world. The four quarters of the city mirrored the four directions of the universe. Even the chinampas were laid out according to cosmological principles. To live in Tenochtitlan was to live inside a prayer. Human sacrifice was the most dramatic and most misunderstood element of Aztec religion. It was real, it was significant, and it was practiced on a scale that shocked the Spanish, but it must be understood within its own context. The Aztecs believed that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world and to keep the sun moving. Human sacrifice was reciprocal, a debt paid to the forces that sustained existence. Without blood, the sun would stop, the rain would fail, the crops would die. Sacrifice was not cruelty for its own sake, it was cosmic maintenance. This does not make it less terrible by modern standards, but it does make it comprehensible as a system of belief, one that was internally consistent and deeply meaningful to the people who practiced it. The thousands who climbed the steps of the Templo Mayor were not merely victims. Within their own worldview, they were participants in the most important act in the universe. And then came 1519, and everything changed. Hernán Cortés landed on the Gulf Coast with 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and a collection of steel weapons that the Aztecs had never seen. He was ambitious, ruthless, and extraordinarily intelligent. He also had extraordinary luck, arriving in a year that the Aztec calendar associated with the god Quetzalcoatl, a pale, bearded deity associated with the East. Some Aztec accounts suggest that Moctezuma initially received Cortés with unusual deference, possibly because of this association, though historians debate how much of this was post-conquest rationalization. What is not debated is the military genius of what followed. Cortés formed alliances with peoples who resented Aztec domination, the Tlaxcalans above all, who had spent generations resisting Aztec expansion and who saw in the Spanish an opportunity for revenge. By the time Cortés marched on Tenochtitlan, he led not 500 men but thousands, the majority of them indigenous warriors with deep grievances against the Aztec Empire. The Spanish entered Tenochtitlan in November 1519 as guests. They marveled at the city. They wrote letters home describing its wonders, and then they took Moctezuma hostage, and everything began to unravel. A massacre of Aztec nobles during a religious festival triggered a full uprising. Cortés and his men were driven from the city on the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, in June 1520, losing hundreds of men and most of their gold as they fled across the causeways in the dark. But Cortés did not give up. He regrouped, rebuilt his alliances, and returned. For 75 days in the summer of 1521, he besieged Tenochtitlan. He cut the aqueducts. He blockaded the lake with brigantines he had built in pieces and carried over the mountains. He systematically destroyed every building his forces captured, so that the rubble could not be used as defensive positions. The Aztecs, already weakened by a smallpox epidemic that had killed Moctezuma's successor and vast numbers of the population, fought with extraordinary courage. But they could not hold. On August 13, 1521, the last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured trying to escape across the lake by canoe. Tenochtitlan had fallen. The city that had taken 2 centuries to build was destroyed in 75 days. The Spanish built their new colonial capital, Mexico City, directly on top of the ruins, using the stones of Aztec temples to build their churches and palaces. For centuries, Tenochtitlan existed only in written accounts and in the memories of those who had seen it. Then, slowly, archaeologists